If you buy the exact same TV in a 98-inch size instead of a 65, should you expect the same performance, just larger? Or does the big one actually look better? Hi, I'm Evan from Rtings.com, and today we're putting the 65-inch Sony BRAVIA 5 next to the giant 98-inch version to see how they really compare. It's the same series, same processor, same Google TV interface, and nearly identical color accuracy and reflection handling. This is not a different model comparison. What we're really looking at is what changes when you scale the panel way up. So what's the short answer? The 98-inch wins in a few important areas, but it's not better across the board. Before we dig into our tests, it's actually helpful to clarify what's the same between these two. Both sizes are 4K VA mini LED sets running Sony's XR processor with Google TV 12, Dolby Vision support, and the same core gaming feature set. Out of the box, their SDR color accuracy is very close. They process video the same way, and their reflection handling measurements are almost identical. You're not jumping into a different tier in the lineup when you move from 65 to 98 inches. You're literally buying the same TV at a different size. So, in this video, we're ignoring characteristics that don't change and focusing on the 5 key areas that do. Black levels, brightness, HDR color volume, motion response, and power use. Both sets were calibrated to almost identical picture settings, so the differences we'll tell you about come from the hardware and the way that Sony tunes each size, not from any trick in the menu. Let's start with black levels, because that's where the 98-inch quietly pulls ahead. In our controlled contrast test, we set the bright part of the cave image to around 200 nits on both TVs, then measured the darkest black that they could produce with local dimming enabled. The white level ends up within a couple of nits between the two, which your eyes cannot really tell apart, but the black floor is noticeably different. The 65-inch lands at roughly 0.0038 nits, while the 98-inch gets down to near 0.002 nits, which almost doubles the effective contrast ratio. In real content, blacks on the 98 look around 47% deeper in a dark room. That difference is absolutely noticeable. What's interesting is that their native contrast without local dimming is very similar, with the 65 actually being slightly ahead. So why does the bigger one look darker when you use dimming? Our best theory, based on zone data, is that the 98 has fewer zones per square inch. Each dimming zone physically covers more screen area, and Sony's algorithm tends to average brightness across a whole zone. When a larger zone dims, it can drive blacks lower. We can't say that with absolute certainty, but it fits what we see in measurements and on the screen. On the flip side, you might expect the 65-inch, with its physically smaller zones, to show less haloing. In practice, the difference is tiny. Sony takes a very conservative approach to avoid obvious halos, so both sizes often fall back to their native contrast in tricky scenes like starfields. The result is that the dark sky between stars can look a little washed out, but you also won't see big white blobs around them on either size. In day-to-day viewing, you'd be hard-pressed to say one blooms more than the other. So, the short version. Black uniformity is similar, haloing is similar as well, but when the dimming does engage, the 98-inch produces visibly deeper blacks. Next up is brightness, where the 98 again has a clear advantage. Looking at HDR first, the numbers aren't subtle. On our window test, the 65 peaks at around the mid-800 nit range, while the 98 hits around 1250 nits on a 25% window and stays near 1000 nits across most window sizes. Depending on the pattern, the big set can be up to 40 to 50% brighter than the 65. You heard that right. In real HDR scenes, this trend holds. In clips with bright lights, the 65 might hit around 400 nits, while the 98 pushes closer to 540. In a warm, high-contrast city shot, the gap is around 30% in favor of the bigger one. Occasionally, the 65 is actually a touch brighter in lower luminance scenes, but the overall trend is that the 98 has more headroom. That extra range lets highlights stand out more in HDR movies and games, and bright, full-screen scenes carry more impact. From a content standpoint, this matters because of how HDR is mastered. A lot of titles are graded with peak elements around 600 or 1000 nits. The 65 tops out below that, which means it has to do more tone mapping to fit those highlights into what it can produce. The 98 can hit or approach that target directly for many elements, so what you see on screen is closer to the creator's intent. In SDR, the story is similar, but a bit more grounded. Our real scene SDR test shows that the 98 is around 190 nits brighter than the 65. The smaller set already gets bright enough for most rooms, but if your space is flooded with light, the extra punch of the 98 can be the difference between simply coping with glare and mostly forgetting about it. Why is the 98 brighter at all? Well, it likely comes down to pixel pitch and how Sony is driving the panel. Both TVs are 4K, so the larger screen has physically bigger pixels, which in theory gives more area for light to pass through. But that's only one part of the story. Things like aperture ratio, backlight power, and driving scheme all play a role. And we know from other TVs that we've tested that bigger sizes aren't always brighter than smaller ones. In the end, there's no mistaking it. The bigger TV is definitely brighter here. Brightness and blacks aren't the whole story though. The 98 also has better HDR color volume. When we map the DCI P3 color space at 1000 nits, the 98 covers around 9% more volume than the 65. Both handle dark shades in a similar fashion, but the bigger TV reaches brighter primaries and secondaries. In other words, reds, greens, and blues can stay saturated at higher luminance levels, which is what gives HDR that vibrant look in colorful scenes. If you look at our luminance measurements for each primary and secondary color, the 98 is a bit brighter across the board. That lines up with what we saw in brightness tests. They can simply push more light while keeping a similar level of color accuracy. In practice, that means that bright colored highlights and accents in HDR can look a bit more vivid on the 98 in a side-by-side comparison. Under the hood, both sizes use the same DGR-VA panel type with a KSF phosphor layer for red and extra conversion elements to lift the red and blue peaks, and their spectral power distribution curves are almost identical, with only tiny differences you won't notice while watching. So the takeaway here isn't that the 98-inch has better colors in a purity sense, it just has more headroom to show bright, saturated shades in HDR, which can give the image a bit more depth and punch next to the 65-inch. Motion is where the 98-inch surprised us most. Most of Sony's LED TVs are known for their fairly slow pixel response times, which can soften fast motion and introduce a bit of black smearing and dark transitions. The 65-inch BRAVIA 5 shows that behavior. It's fine, but you can see softness and smears in fast games or quick camera movements. When we measured the cumulative absolute deviation at 120 Hz, the 98-inch was much faster across the entire table. Transitions that start from black and move up to brighter values finish noticeably faster in the 98, and transitions back down towards dark shades are more than twice as fast on average. This reduces long trails behind moving objects and cuts down on some of that smeary look you see when panning across dark scenes. There is a trade-off. The bigger TV shows more overshoot on many transitions, which can introduce some inverse ghosting, especially in high contrast edges. The 65 is more conservative and barely overshoots at all. Even so, in practice, the 98 still looks sharper in motion because it hits its target values much more quickly. You see that at 120 Hz and at 60 Hz. For gaming, if you care about motion clarity and you sit far back enough to enjoy those glorious 98 inches, the big one is clearly more satisfying. Input lag and gaming features, like HDMI 2.1 bandwidth and VRR support, are essentially the same, so the key difference you feel in games really does come down to this response time gap. Of course, a 98-inch panel doesn't run for free. The big TV has a screen area around 2.3 times that of the 65-inch, and power consumption tracks that pretty closely. In our power consumption test, the 98 tends to sit around the 430 to 450 watt range. The 65 consumes a lot less power than that. That means you pay significantly more on your energy bill if you watch a lot of TV on the big set, on top of the higher purchase price. Over the lifetime of the product, that difference adds up. So while it's tempting to think it's the same TV, just bigger, you do need to weigh ongoing power costs along with the upfront hit. So does bigger mean better for the Sony BRAVIA 5? Well, from a pure performance standpoint, yeah. The 98 has noticeably deeper blacks, more impactful HDR and SDR brightness, better HDR color volume, and much faster response times that give it clearer motion, especially in games. Side by side, the differences are not subtle. The 98 looks more energetic, and motion holds together better when things get busy on screen. Both sizes share the same strengths in processing, color accuracy, and features, and their local dimming behavior and halo control are very similar. Black uniformity is close enough that it won't be a deciding factor either. The real question is whether those gains justify the cost. The 98-inch is expensive, it needs a lot of wall or furniture space, and it draws a lot more power. If you're building a big home theater or a large open living room and you want a screen that fills your field of view and also performs better than the mid-size version, the 98-inch BRAVIA 5 is worth aiming for. If you're more budget conscious, sit closer to the screen, or simply don't need a wall-filling display, the 65 still gives you good performance, and the same feature set at a much more attainable price and running cost. In short, the 98-inch BRAVIA 5 isn't just a bigger copy, it's the better performer. The 65 is the practical choice. Pick the one that fits your room, your budget, and how committed you are to going truly huge. Well, that's it for a comparison of the 65 and 98-inch BRAVIA 5s. We've now bought 5 98 or 100-inch TVs for testing, including this one. So if you're interested in truly massive screens, expect more content around them soon. Let us know in the comments what you'd like us to compare or test with these extra large TVs, and we'll keep it in mind for future videos. Until next time, I'm Evan from Rtings.com, where we help you find the best products for your needs.